Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Absent Justice with me, Moazzam Begg. Over the past 9 episodes of this series, we've spoken about harrowing human rights abuses and invited those involved onto the programme. But this week, for our 10th episode, we've decided to focus on the work of the human rights organisation Cageprisoners and the challenges it faces. As many of you may already know, I'm the director of the organisation, but it was a role that was thrust upon me. I was held in extrajudicial detention in Bagram and Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for nearly 3 years before being finally released in 2005. It was then that I decided to join Cageprisoners, championing the cause of people in similar situations, especially the prisoners I'd met along the way, who unfortunately remain behind bars to this day. Before I introduce my guests, however, here's a short report by Houria Al-Haddad.
In this East London building exists the headquarters of a human rights organisation, which has become one of the most rapidly growing and respected of its kind in the UK. Ever since its inception in October 2003, the Cageprisoners website has been raising awareness about the plight of Muslim prisoners languishing in detention centres around the world. Its director, Moazzam Begg, is a former Guantanamo Bay detainee who was released without charge in 2005 by the former Bush administration. He says despite the repeated promises made to close down the controversial prison, it remains open, which is exactly why organisations like Cageprisoners must continue their work.
The reality is that most people in Guantanamo have not been charged. Most have been cleared for release by the Bush administration, and yet there is still no light at the end of the tunnel.
Victoria Britton, a journalist and patron of the organisation, says it's tragic that so many ordinary innocent Muslims have had their lives ruined by the war on terror.
In the aftermath of 9/11 and the beginning of the so-called war on terror, what happened was there was an incredible sort of fishing expedition by the Americans in which they scooped up not only all these hundreds of men in Pakistan and Afghanistan and all over the world and sent them to Guantanamo, but they also started looking for people who they thought, Muslim men who they thought were somehow connected to a kind of worldwide Al-Qaeda threat. And they have paid a terrible price, and their families have paid a price and are still paying a price. And I think for lots and lots of young Muslims, as an example of how frightening the world is and how unfair it is for them, and that they too could pay such a price.
Over the years, the organisation has carried out many impressive campaigns and produced groundbreaking reports on the lack of due process and the rule of law. Now a respected human rights charity, which has worked with high-profile organisations including Amnesty, Reprieve and Liberty, Cageprisoners has established itself as the leading champion of the rights of Muslims who've been detained, tortured or even killed as part of America's so-called war on terror.
Well, joining me in the studio is Asim Qureshi, the Executive Director of Cageprisoners. We'll also be pleased to be joined by Arnaud, Mafille, a researcher who has published a report on French and British complicity in the torture of Muslim prisoners. And on the phone, we have Shazana Hafiz, a Cageprisoners volunteer from Manchester. Welcome to you all. Asim, we of course work together often in our office, but this is a rather new step. Let me just ask you, when I first joined the organisation, you were already well involved. It had been set up and established, and you were working on various reports about ghost prisoners and Guantanamo. Why did you first get involved in the organisation early back in when you did?
Yeah, I mean, I did my master's in the laws of armed conflict and the use of force, and generally on issues related to international law and international human rights law. I actually did my dissertation on Guantanamo Bay, particularly the term unlawful combatant. So when I was researching the issue, I stumbled across the Cageprisoners website. I emailed them saying, maybe you can help me with my dissertation. They emailed me back and said, it's us, your friends from London, why don't you help us instead, seeing as we've just set up. So I kind of started off volunteering, helping with little bits and pieces here and there. And eventually, I think, after my master's ended, we decided to take the step of formalizing as an NGO because we found that we had a lot of relevance. Initially, it was just supposed to be a website that gave information about Guantanamo and about other prisons around the world related to the war on terror. But we realized we were playing a role that was far greater than that, because people were coming to us asking us directly for help. So rather than just sending these people on to other organizations, we thought, well, we can do a lot of this work ourselves. You know,
and why was it the case?
difficult.
Why was it that Cage Prisoners then became this, you know, let's do a lot of this work ourselves? Why wasn't it being outsourced to other reputable or well-known organizations?
Well, I mean, what we found, we were initially doing that, but what we found is that people came to us because they trusted us. We have an Islamic ethos, which is very important, obviously, for the victims of the war on terror, who are predominantly Muslim. The vast majority of our clientele are Muslim, and so they trust us immediately. We don't have to try and present who we are, what our agenda is. They know that what we're trying to work towards is due process for all those we're trying to help. And so because that trust issue was already established, we felt that we should take advantage of that in order to help these people, rather than just simply passing them on.
And who was it, you know, who was it that established this Cage Prisoners? Who were the individuals, and what were their goals and aims and objectives?
I mean, the original founders, I wasn't part of them. I came on maybe a year or so later. But, you know, they were effectively just a group of activists from South London. They went to a number of Muslim organizations to ask them to help on the issue of Guantanamo, particularly for the British men who were still there, people like yourself. You were still in Guantanamo at the time. And they wanted, you know, these organizations to help. At that time, the climate was quite fearful. People were very scared of taking on this issue. There was a lot of talk about, you know, if these people are there, there's no smoke without fire. The Americans wouldn't hold people unless they knew that they were terrorists. So people weren't willing to assist. So the original founders decided that, well, actually, we can't you can't rely on everybody. We just need to do something for ourselves, and that's really where Cage Prisoners came from.
So then, of course, Cage Prisoners then became almost, I think, within, at least in the Muslim community, if not elsewhere, a household name, and it became very popular in a sense. But in terms of what propelled you as an individual, what is it that made you join the organisation and think about the cases that still today people are campaigning for, even when you began?
As I mentioned, my background's in law. And in fact, I was supposed to be a corporate lawyer. I'd applied for my master's in corporate law. But seeing the jumpsuits in Guantanamo, seeing the way that these men were being treated, and at the time my friend Babar Ahmed had also been had already been arrested once, and now had been placed under an extradition warrant as well to the US. You know, the culmination of those things convinced me that actually, you know, you can't sit by and just, you know, watch these things take place. And so I decided to, you know, alhamdulillah, dedicate myself to this work.
That brings me on to Shazana. Assalamu alaikum, Shazana. I would just like to ask you why you, as somebody who we've known in Cage Prisoners for quite some time, first got involved, and where did you first hear about Cage Prisoners, and why is it that you feel so passionate about the organisation?
Okay, I first came to know of Cage Prisoners through an event that I attended at university organisation, and what I heard and felt that day moved me. And from then on, this is going back 5 or 6 years now, I sort of have taken it upon me to support and raise awareness about the work that Cage Prisoners does. In over the last few years, from when I first sort of got involved to now, it's been amazing in terms of the progression that the organisation's made. Post 9/11, obviously there was a shift in terms of how Muslims have been perceived. You had the anti-terror legislations come into place. So a lot happening nationally and internationally. And what I found was perhaps issues that were not being discussed so openly are now openly being discussed because of the awareness that Cage Prisoners as an organisation is doing.
And in terms of, you know, you're obviously based up in the north in Manchester. Have you seen any sorts of a different approach, say, to anti-terror legislation, towards Cage Prisoners' work, towards the issues we deal with as compared to the south, or is it pretty much across the board that people are as active up north as they are down south?
I think it's across the board. I mean, even in Manchester, we've recently had the case of the Faruqi case, and yeah, you will have individuals that are perhaps still that bit more reluctant to get involved with the work, but then at the same time, I feel that people are a lot more open to questioning, a lot more open to saying, we would like to get involved, we would like to support the work, we want to know what is happening, we'd like to understand the issues. And
one of the things I'd ask you, Shazana, is that in terms of empowerment, because I know one of the things that Cage Prisoners seeks to do is not just to do campaign work and to raise awareness, but also seeks to empower the people, as Asim said, who are directly affected, the Muslim community. Do you think it's doing that, or it has done that, or it has got a long way to go in achieving that goal?
I think we're getting there. I think from where things were 6 years ago to where just sort of looking at incidents and cases that we have in Manchester, again using the Faruqi case, the way people have come on board, it's been amazing, just a response from the community, Muslim and non-Muslim. I think as an organisation, Cage Prisoners have got a long way to go, but in terms of empowering communities and giving people the confidence to say, look, it's, come on board, support the work, it's important to know the issues. Again, it's being achieved, but it's taking those steps gradually and getting there eventually. Mm-hmm.
Arnaud, you of course began relatively recently with Cage Prisoners. You entered an internship at the organisation and then were taken on full-time as a researcher. What's your background? What brought you into this field, and what is your field?
Actually, my background is quite similar to Asim's one.
You're both French?
No. I was a student in international law and human rights, mm-hmm. and so I was quite familiar with those issues of arbitrary detention, torture, and so on. Meanwhile, I became Muslim, so I started to learn about, the obligation of Muslims towards Muslim prisoners and so on, mm-hmm. and so forth. And I was trying to see what were the similarities and differences between, let's say, the Islamic system of justice and the international system of justice. And a friend of mine who was helped by Cage Prisoners told me, look, I think that's for you, helping the Muslim prisoners, and that's trying to champion justice, so you should have a look into it. So I applied for the internship, and I went through, and I started to work on those issues.
Okay, at the great fear of being exposed in public, what did you discover inside Cage Prisoners as an organisation in terms of comparison to the outside and working on the inside?
I discovered that it's quite... there's still a lot of fear from people, mm-hmm. but I think that Cage Prisoners has removed a lot of this fear. And I've seen a lot of different people that I wouldn't expect to come to Cage Prisoners from their background to be willing to be involved, when people that I would think would be more inclined to be involved in Cage Prisoners wouldn't. Mm-hmm. So that's something that kind of surprised me.
And your focus area, this is really important for all our viewers and people interested in human rights issues, in the war on terror and detention and so forth, is that we of course talk very often about United Kingdom cases, English-speaking cases, American cases, but we hear very little about what's happening in Europe, in France, yeah. and elsewhere, and that's your focus.
That's right.
What have you learnt in the research that you've done over the past year or so in terms of what's happening in Europe and anti-terror legislation and measures?
Well, actually, I've learned a lot myself, because contrary to this country, on the continent, and these issues are not spoken about.
Why is this?
Because maybe there's less freedom of speech, or the culture of activism is less strong than here.
In the other European countries?
Yeah, that's right. So, for example, I didn't even know that there was a French legislation on anti-terrorism. So that's something that I came to know working in Cage Prisoners, or for Cage Prisoners.
Something I remember I learnt from you while you were working on a particular case was that France was able to extradite people to countries that they had nothing to do with. Can you just give me a little example of where this comes from, what it means?
It's basically because the remit of the French justice when it comes to terrorism is very wide. So basically, if I've done something in France, maybe I've given you a call, then that's enough. And you might even be in Pakistan, that doesn't matter. That's a French matter, so you have to come to France to be tried. So on that basis, even if you've never been to France in your life, you can be tried in France.
And what I meant
sentenced.
was that France would extradite people, say for example, a Moroccan or a Tunisian to Gambia or to the Senegal, that he's a country that he's never been to.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Basically, very often France tries to extradite people to country where they might be tortured.
Even though they've never been to that country or had anything to do with that country?
No, basically, they try to do that, but the European Court of Human Rights is going to stop them. So as an alternative, they try to negotiate with other countries. So you might end up in a country such as Senegal or Togo, even if you've never been there.
And you have no relationship to that country at all, and you can still be sent there as part of this agreement?
Yeah, because basically they're going to make an agreement with this country, and you might end up homeless over there without no money.
It sounds like something out of the days of transportation. Asim, you have written a book, Rules of Engagement. It talks about deportations and detentions in the War on Terror. You made I wouldn't say a discovery, but a generalization in terms of the people held in the War on Terror, wherever they are. What conclusion did your book come to? What was this discovery, if we call this?
I mean, I guess the basic premise of the book is that wherever you go in the world, whatever counterterrorism policy you look at, effectively they're tantamount to the same thing, which is people not being given their due process and being picked up solely because they're Muslim. I mean, that's really the primary indicator for these various countries about what they should be effectively looking for. The book details a number of policies in different countries, and effectively with all the cases that I show, it doesn't matter if you're a foreign national living in the UK or you're a UK citizen in a foreign country, or any citizen really anywhere in the world. The treatment that you are given, if you are a practicing, and even in some cases a non-practicing Muslim, as long as you're suspected of being involved in some kind of terrorism or some kind of plot, your rights are stripped away from you, and that's effectively the general premise of the book.
Okay, so and in terms of course, in your book you talk all about the detentions process and so forth, but there's other things that have happened. We're now talking about thought crime coming along, people being convicted for writing books and disseminating those books and thoughts and ideas and whatever. We're also in a world where the drone strikes are prevalent and being used almost every day. Where has Cage Prisoners work, and where do you see Cage Prisoners work moving along over the next 5 to 10 years going? Do you see it still 5 to 10 years' time we'll be campaigning on Guantanamo, secret renditions and so forth, or will we be going somewhere else?
Well, I think with Guantanamo, definitely 5 years' time, we're still going to be working on Guantanamo. They've just reinitiated the military commissions process, so there will be trials taking place there. Those trials are going to last for a number of years, 5 years at the very minimum, I should imagine. So for the long term, at least anyway, Guantanamo is going to be a live issue for us. Unfortunately, we know that there's still secret detention taking place worldwide. We know that people are being tortured, they're being arbitrarily detained, they're being picked up by security agencies and are going missing. Unfortunately, the Arab Spring hasn't brought as much change as we would have liked. Yes, in certain countries, but other countries are getting worse.
But indeed, we discovered a great deal of what was underneath the surface with the Arab Spring and the exposure that the British intelligence service and others were involved in renditions.
That's right. Libya is an excellent example of that, how the British were absolutely complicit in these deportations and renditions that were taking place to Libya, and the extent that they were working with Gaddafi in order to make that happen. But of course, this is just the beginning. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that, as you mentioned already, that certain crimes are now being created effectively to criminalize belief. The implementation of a prevent strategy here in the UK and indeed across the Atlantic in America, the Americans have now copied the UK's prevent strategy and implemented it over there, will effectively criminalize Islamic belief. So if you believe in certain strands of Islam, or if you believe in certain Islamic concepts, that will be enough to get you convicted. And this is a very, very dangerous time for Muslims, especially those living within the Western world. So unfortunately, cage prisons work is probably going to continue for a number of years yet, as we see an increase in the types of convictions.
Very few people would say, unfortunately, our work will continue. Most people would like their work to continue for a while, but
yeah,
the nature of the beast, of course, is that we would rather not be here.
Yeah, we're like many other human rights organizations, we'd rather not exist.
Shazana, a final word to you. As somebody who's been involved in campaigning, raising awareness as a Cage Prisoners volunteer, what would you advise our viewers and other people interested in Cage Prisoners? What would you tell them to do based on your experience and based on your knowledge?
I think it's very important to realise that some of the issues that Asim and Arnaud have raised, they are issues that affect all of us directly. And on that note, it's very important that we are aware and we make ourselves aware of these issues. And Cage Prisoners is an organisation that is raising that awareness. And one of the things, or some of the things rather, that we can do is support the campaigns, the events, hold events in our local areas, host seminars, and do our bit to raise awareness within our communities.
In terms of the future for organisations like Cage Prisoners, do you, like Asim, see that there's a greater need now for Cage Prisoners, or is there less so? People have returned from Guantanamo, and so there's less reason for Cage Prisoners to be around?
No, certainly not. I think more a reason for Cage Prisoners to be around and continue doing the work that they do. I think it is at this moment in time, I personally see it at the forefront of raising awareness at this level about illegal detention, rendition, torture.
Okay. Cage Prisoners at the forefront. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this week. I would like to thank my guests, the production staff, and especially you at home for watching. If you'd like to know more about Cage Prisoners, you can visit the website www.cageprisoners.com. Inshallah, you can join us again in 2 weeks' time. Make sure you tune in then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.